G'day and welcome to Reality Check. Before we start this week's show, here's a little bit about our sponsor for this week. Dr. Stephen Gundry has this concept called caloric bypass. He says the key to losing weight and keeping it off is not in carbs or fat or even in probiotic-rich foods. Instead, it comes down to a specific switch you can flip in your body to flush out unnecessary calories. And by activating this specific process in our body, he says he's seen thousands of people dramatically improve their health, even at age 50 and beyond. Dr. Gundry has lost 70 pounds himself using his research, and he's kept the weight off for over 20 years and counting. His digestive issues are gone, his health is fantastic, and he feels younger and healthier today than he did in his 40s. His video's been watched by over 20 million people to date, and you can watch and learn more about it at thehealthyfat.com/Ross. That's thehealthyfat.com/Ross. It's linked at the bottom of this video, and just click thehealthyfat.com/Ross. Now, let's get on with the show. It's amazing to be here in the Valley of the Kings, which is where many of the pharaohs were buried in secret, with a huge number of the incredible treasures, the things that Howard Carter described when he found the tomb of Tutankhamun as wonderful things. But there's a mystery, there's a conundrum behind that whole story. Who on earth made these incredible technologies, these fine stone vases, the beautiful carved statuary, the incredibly well-honed granite blocks that are accurate, sometimes within micromillimeters? How do we explain those technologies with what we understand were the tools of that era? The pre-dynastic Egyptian civilizations, if they were lucky at all, had copper chisels. More likely, they had flints and stone adzes. Then how do we explain the beautiful objects, the wonderful things that Howard Carter described when he opened the tomb of Tutankhamun? That's what we're bringing Ben van Kirkwyk on to Reality Check this week to talk about. Ben's been studying ancient Egypt and the relics of ancient Egypt for a very long time, and he has a fascinating story to tell. Join me on this week's Reality Check with Ben van Kirkwyk. Ben van Kirkwyk, welcome to Reality Check.
Ross, thank you very much for the introduction. That's very kind. And likewise, I will say I'm also have been a fan of your work for quite some time, and it's a real honor to be here.
Well, mate, we love the idea of causing mischief with doctrinaire dogmaticism. And one of the things I love about Uncharted X is you take us down paths with fastidious detail and analysis. And I find if I read online, you're often debunked by doctrinaire archaeology and dismissed out of hand. And frankly, there's not a lot of logic behind how they're so dismissive. I think one of the things I like to do on Reality Check is bring people face to face with obvious mysteries. Just like the UAP mystery, it's in plain sight. And the evidence that I see that you're citing it's in plain sight. It's right under our noses. So, mate, very quickly, before we get into ancient Egypt, give me the Orthodox model of human history. Tell me when human civilization is meant to have begun.
Well, you're quite right when you talk about the doctrine and the dismissal of perspectives that are alternative or that have an alternate timeline, or they are suggesting alternate perspectives on our ancient history. And in fact, our perspective on human civilization and the history of it really hasn't changed very much over the last 150 years. It's one of those things that stayed fairly static. The Orthodox timeline suggests that civilization really started only some 6,000 years ago. And this is, of course, the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, ancient that part of the world. That was the Babylonians and Mesopotamians started what we call civilization. Then closely followed by the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Chinese, etc. Only some 4,000 BC, 6,000 years ago, which has led us to a path of, I guess, our modern civilization today. That doctrine, which is what it is, has been increasingly challenged by new discoveries across many different scientific fields, as well as discoveries from within archaeology itself. And unfortunately, for one reason or another, it really hasn't affected, I guess, the mainstream position of civilization itself. One of the things that I like to point to is having shifted dramatically during this period where we've thought civilization is 6,000 years ago, is the extension of the human timeline itself. So for a long time, if you go back far enough before the age of reason, the age of science, you have the biblical interpretation of the human species, 6,000 years. The rise of science starts, and then the estimates get up to, well, maybe we're 50,000 years old as a species. Then we create techniques like, radiocarbon dating, C14 dating. They find some human remains in Ethiopia. And for many decades, they were dated to around 195,000 years old. So that was said to have been the oldest human remains. Yeah, go ahead.
I want to cite one example that really leapt out at me when I watched one of your videos. You talk about a burial site at a place called Toshka, and it's quite phenomenal because there's a corpse lying in a prone position in a fairly primitive grave, but there's something in that grave that really made me sit up, because the carbon-14 dating on what's in that grave suggests that it's 14,500 years old. What was found in that grave, Ben?
So Toshka is one of many sites that is in the southern area of Egypt, sort of northern Sudan, southern Egypt. And these are essentially Neolithic burials. So as you say, like in that 14,500 year time frame. But one of the biggest mysteries, and Toshka certainly isn't the only one. There are many, many other sites like this. But in that grave, in this shallow grave with a fetal position corpse, they're finding very primitive pottery, bone and bead ornaments, but also they found these remarkable hard stone vases or vessels, and they're made from incredibly hard stones, granite, diorite, and they seem to have been made with just remarkable precision. They're these, what I'd like to call kind of an out of place artifact that really
this is what I love, because this is the sort of stuff you're citing as evidence of a potential prior human civilization that as yet doesn't fit onto our timeline. Because when you're talking about precision vases, let's talk about how precise these vases are, because this is where I was watching your Uncharted X and I almost fell off my chair and I started tweeting in support of you saying, gosh, this is incredible. People have got to watch this. And I wasn't ready for the barrage of insults that you cop from contemporary archaeology. It's just amazing.
Yes.
And as you may have noticed with me, I really enjoy upsetting some people who have very doctrinaire positions on things. And there was no explanation from any of them as to how these precision vases could have been made. But let's firstly, with the Toshka site that you're talking about, there's no doubt that these precision vases were recovered from this site. That they're not something that was inserted later on.
Well, no, because these sites, there's actually not a lot of records of these excavations for a number of reasons. These happened in the 1960s. Boston University and Harvard were doing the work down on this site, and many others in that I guess that Neolithic period. And all of those sites today are underwater. They were all excavated prior to the building of the the Great Dam in Egypt on the Nile, and the creation of Lake Nasser, which is the largest man-made lake in the world now. But so they're all underwater. So we have to go on these photographs and these older records of these finds. But it's not controversial whatsoever to classify these precision hardstone vessels and vases as being pre-dynastic, so before the dynastic Egyptian civilization, because not only do we find them in these sites that date back as potentially as far back as 15,000 years, we find them in other cultures that predate the Egyptian cultures like the Naqada culture and the Naqada II culture, and then right up to the very early parts of the dynastic Egyptian civilization itself.
So how precise
this is where we find these
then?
vessels.
How precise are the vases that were found, for example, in that burial site?
So it's long been a mystery. People have always wondered about this, but it's only been in recent, really the last couple of years, that we've been able to get our hands on some of these vessels and do proper analysis on them using things like structured light scanning or CT X-ray scanning and modern metrology. the examples that we've looked at have proven to be just remarkably precise is the best term I can give you. So if you want to talk about how precise, you're talking about aerospace industry levels of precision, where you're working in single thousandths of an inch. And for the metric viewers out there, we're talking about, 25 to 30 or 40 microns, which is, a thousandth of a millimeter. And when you're working in those...
What's that in relation to, say, a human hair?
So a human hair is between, I think, 2 to 3 thousandths of an inch thick. So you might be talking like 50 to 75 microns. So it's less than the thickness of a human hair. And this is the margin of error that we're seeing on some of these vessels. If you want a really insane example, the best example of precision in terms of circularity on one of these vessels that was recently analyzed, the difference between on the X and Y radius, so that the top of the vessel as you measure it in one direction relative to another, the error of margin that we found there was 4/10,000ths of a millimeter, so 4/10ths of a single micron. That's probably the best example that we found, which is absolutely mind-bending precision.
So forgive me for interrupting there, but just so our audience understand, when you're talking about the margin of error, you're talking about the accuracy of the thickness of the stone. Solid stone. It's diorite. In some cases, it's granite. And it's been cut to a thickness which is absurdly thin. And there's a consistency of that thickness.
Right. So there's a lot of different ways to measure precision and accuracy on these vessels and these objects. So circularity, roundness, consistency of the material. When I'm talking about precision, it's like how accurately is it made relative to other surfaces. So the center line of the vase, like how accurate are the edges of the vase to it? How round is the top of it? That type of thing. And that's where we're getting these remarkable measurements from. So perfectly circular to within 4/10,000ths of a millimeter. In terms of wall thickness, that's another aspect of the remarkable engineering and machining that's gone into these, because you do have materials like granite, like diorite, porphyry, schist, these other very hard types of stone. Not only are they down to, like a 40th of an inch, so, less than a millimeter thick in some places. These materials are brittle at that. It's like glass. A cube of glass is very strong, but if you get it down very thin, it's the same material. It's hard, but it's very brittle. And that's the same case for stones like this. It's made even more difficult by the fact that many of these stones have large crystal inclusions in them. So the material goes from hard to soft as it's being worked. But whoever made these things, had the ability to machine them down to just very, very thin tolerances indeed, and keep it consistent. And it would be, put it this way, it would be an incredible challenge for us to replicate these sort of things today, even with our best machines and tools. And as of yet, we haven't really done it.
Now, I think the Toshka example leapt out at me because it was just so absurd. I mean, that's a grave that's 14,500 years old. I mean, indeed, that's incredible.
Yes, there are many others like it, like in that region of Toshka, and it doesn't match up when you compare it or you look at it within the capabilities of that civilization, which was obviously a fairly primitive civilization. Shallow grave, bone and bead ornaments, and very primitive pottery, like handmade pottery, nothing even turned on a wheel. So these are these out-of-place artifacts, and I think that another explanation for them, and one that makes a lot more sense when you consider the evidence, is the idea of inheritance. If you are a Stone Age people and you're in the business of making pottery vessels, if you found a stone vessel, like you're probably using stone tools, but if you found this stone vessel that's just perfectly made and remarkable, it's going to intrinsically become valuable. And that vessel's probably going to, propagate through the social structure. It's going to be buried with the chieftain or the king at the time. And that's where we find them. And the same process seems to have gone on in those cultures preceding the dynastic Egyptians, and indeed to the dynastic Egyptians themselves. One of the biggest mysteries I find about the vases, and one that shines a light on a lot of the contradictions when it comes to ancient Egypt, is the fact that we do find these vessels in the ancient Egyptian civilization, but only at the very start of it. So 3rd, 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, they found 50, 60,000 of these things buried beneath pyramids. And even the archaeologists admit that these are inherited heirlooms. They know they came from earlier times and that the Egyptian kings of the time buried them with them. And they, after that period, they really just disappear from that civilization. It's like they didn't have the capability to make them.
Can I ask you this, Ben? What is the view, if you to articulate the view of modern archaeology, mainstream archaeology, what do they say about this notion of a prior human civilization that predates, for example, dynastic Egypt?
Well, they do know there were cultures, not so much civilizations. There were primitive cultures like Nakata, but they just suggest that it's that all of the reports of it are myth and legend. I mean, one of the other major contradictions is the dynastic Egyptians themselves do have their own history. They trace back their own culture and civilization nearly 40,000 years. They have a king's list, and there's a number of different reports of this, and they go back to other periods, as do many other cultures. They have cataclysm stories and flood stories, and they talk about advanced civilizations, their ancestors with amazing capabilities, somehow being destroyed by cataclysm and starting again. But modern archaeologists and historians generally just dismiss that as myth and legend, and they say, well, no, the real history starts with, you know, Nama, the first king of the first dynasty, and that's when the civilization starts. They just classify everything else as myth and legend.
So let's talk about the accepted Orthodox model of human history. One of the stories you've done, you talked about a 2006 New Scientist article that presented a timeline of human evolution. And
Right.
officially, humans emerged, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is still the case in Orthodox evolutionary theory. Humans emerged around about 195, 200,000 years ago, and the carbon 14 dating of the oldest modern human remains starts from around about 200,000 years ago.
That was the case in 2006, yes.
So what do we know now?
Well, so the story has changed since then. It's a good example of how new discoveries can change the story of our own species and history. So since then, since 2006, they've actually they made another discovery in I think Morocco. They found a jawbone of a human, and this was dated to slightly beyond, I think, 300,000 years. So instantly, it's like the human species just got a whole third of that time longer. We added another 100,000 years to the human timeline. And, you know, these discoveries and these advances in science have progressed even further than that. And today, that remains the oldest human record in the fossil record. But now we've got studies that look at things like DNA evidence when, you know, Neanderthals, which genetically speaking are our cousins, when we and Neanderthals evolved from a common ancestor, that date is somewhere in the realm of 800 to 900,000 years. Similarly, there have been studies done on teeth morphology. So how do we have the teeth that we have, and at what rates would dental evolution need to happen for us to get sort of the teeth that we have? And they did a massive study on the statistical analysis of teeth morphology. And it showed that for us to have the teeth that we have, we would have had to have been around some, again, 8 to 900,000 years. So I think the timeline for the human species keeps getting longer and longer. And when you put that date of civilization of, you know, only 6,000 years ago in the context of a period of time when you might have had modern humans on this planet for as much as 8 or 900,000 years, it starts to look a little ridiculous.
So officially, the Orthodox model would have it that agriculture only began 10,000 years ago. And yet that would appear to be totally inconsistent with even the grave we talked about at the head of this interview, which is a grave that's 14,500 years old. There are these holes in the archaeological record that are not explained by the Orthodox model.
Indeed, yeah, there are many mysteries and many contradictions when you take a close look at all of the evidence that surrounds the history of human civilization. The more that we learn, it's like it is a difficult process and a difficult period of time to try and analyze, right? We really do have very scant evidence. We're looking back through the mists of time, and the further back you go, the more scant that evidence becomes. And the more, you know, it's like there's been more civilizations that have had the chance to live in these areas and to change what you're looking at. So you have to continually evaluate the best evidence to try and put together the best theory that you can. My problem, I think, with the Orthodox perspective on particularly the date of civilization is that a lot of this new evidence that comes up forms like things like Gobekli Tepe in Turkey. I mean, this was a massive megalithic site. that it is 12,000 years old. At least, in fact, there's strong evidence that it may well be much older than that.
So just to make the point here, officially, the Orthodox model still has it that around about 4,000 to 3,500 BC, the first civilization was the Sumerians of Mesopotamia. And then you had the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, and the Chinese. But human civilization basically started 4,000 years ago.
Well, 4,000 BC.
4,000 BC, yeah.
Yeah, 6,000 years ago. Yes, that is still the Orthodox position. So everything prior to that we were considered to be hunter-gatherer. Like humans existed, but we were nomadic hunter-gatherers. Civilization, you define civilization with things like permanent dwelling, large numbers of people. You get specialization, social structures, governance, these types of things. Agriculture is another one that organized agriculture is another sign of civilization. Cities, those types of things. So prior to 4,000 BC, none of these things are thought to have existed, yet we keep finding more and more evidence that, in fact, they did.
Now, you talked about Gobekli Tepe, which is in southeastern Turkey. It's a stunning discovery, a massive megalithic site. And we know that carbon-14 dating of organic material in the actual pillars at that site shows that it's at least 12,000 years old. And just to give the audience an account of it, it's got what we believe are astronomically aligned stones, possibly a celestial calendar, stone circles arranged geometrically. How does that obvious construction, and it's an elaborate construction, fit into the notion that civilization happened many thousands of years later?
Well, if you want to look at the Orthodox or the mainstream perspective on Gobekli Tepe, and you can find this today, even if you go look at the Wikipedia page for it. Not that Wikipedia is a tremendously reliable source when it comes to controversial topics, but they will tell you that this was something built by hunter-gatherers. So rather than changing the date of civilization, they literally changed the definition of hunter-gatherers to, well, okay, they're not just nomadic tribes people, but now they're also guys that they seem to enjoy doing a bit of megalithic pillar building on the weekends, maybe to get away from the wife and kids or something like that. I'm not sure.
Okay, so let's go through that. Let's deal with that. What's your response to that? I mean, my understanding is some of these pillars at Gobekli Tepe, the T-shaped pillars, they're hundreds of tons.
Well, no, they're not that big. They are. It is a significant logistical challenge. Some of these, you're talking 20 feet tall, 20 to 30 tons, single piece stones, arranged very elaborately. They, in some cases, taken significant distance, like many miles from the quarries from where they were formed. The interesting thing about Gobekli Tepe, there are many things. This is a brand new discovery. It was really uncovered by a German archaeologist in the 1990s, and it's been excavated ever since. It's a site that has a lot of nuance to it. So the carbon dating that we have for that, where it's incontrovertibly 12,000 years old at least, we actually get those dates not from the pillars, but from these cobblestone walls that are enclosing these pillars. And there's strong evidence, and anyone that goes there would be able to see this for themselves. It's as if that site was rebuilt, like these primitive walls that surround these pillars and these stone circles. They were built to kind of repair and prop up these pillars. In some cases, there are actually broken pieces of pillars in these walls. And it's from those primitive walls that we get this date of 12,000 years old.
So do you think Gobekli Tepe might actually be a bit older?
I do, yes. I think that's it. Probably significantly older. I think that there were people that came to this site that found it, or they knew about it, and they rebuilt that site. They protected it. In fact, the walls encompass the pillars. They cover up some of the details. And as I said, there's actually broken pieces of pillar, as if those pillars had already fallen and broken when they built these walls. And we date it based on the organic material found in these cobblestone, these rough cobblestone walls that surround it. There's clearly two different styles of architecture here as well. Like one is a megalithic style with these massive single piece pillars with intricate high relief carvings on them that have these astronomical alignments and all sorts of significance. Martin Sweatman has written an entire book on this topic. It's fascinating. And then you have this primitive cobblestone walls that came along and were built to essentially restore and protect the site. It probably was a sacred site to these people. And it's from the remains of those people that we can date it to 12,000 years back, which was an absolute, just shocking revelation at the time to the world of archaeology. Nobody thought that this type of megalithic building was existed at all 12,000 years ago, and it and of itself should have shifted the date of civilization back. It's a massive megalithic site. There are hundreds of these T pillars. It requires a significant number of people. It requires specialization. It requires all of these facets of civilization to even undertake this sort of thing. And here's the crazy thing about that part of Turkey is not only so Gobekli Tepe was the first site, but since that site's been uncovered, they've discovered that there might be as many as 40 more sites just like it in that region of southeastern Turkey. And I don't think there's any question we're talking about an unknown civilization existing in that point way back in time.
So tell me about Karahan Tepe. It's even older, isn't it, than Gobekli Tepe?
It is. Yes, at Karahan Tepe, nearby to Gobekli Tepe in that southeastern part of Turkey. It's another site that was found. It's something like 5 times as large as Gobekli Tepe. There is up to maybe 1,000 T-pillars on this site, these large T-pillars and many, many stone circles. It's in the process of being excavated. I've visited the site many times myself, and it's dated to at least somewhere around 500 to 1,000 years older than Gobekli Tepe. In fact, there's been more sites discovered recently that even are older than that, based on the carbon dating that they found. But it seems clear to me that there is much as is being discovered in the Amazon by guys like Graham Hancock at the moment. There is evidence that there was an entire lost civilization that we know nothing about that existed in this part of the world at that time. And this discovery should really be shaking the foundations of our ideas on human civilization and when it truly started to its core. But as of yet, it really hasn't had that impact, at least according to the textbooks and the universities. It's unfortunate because I think that the evidence is becoming overwhelming that that there was indeed some pretty advanced human activity going on long ago and in periods of time that happened before, cataclysms and the Younger Dryas, which is a huge part of this whole mystery.
While we're on the subject, let's tell our American friends about the truth of the claims that the first settlement of the Americas by humans was about 12,000 years ago. I think the conventional explanation isn't it, that there was a land bridge that connected America to the essentially the European continent through Russia.
Right. Yes.
What's the truth now? What do we now know?
So indeed, yeah. So the Orthodox story has long been that there was the Bering Land Bridge that was an ice-free corridor between the great ice sheets, the Cordarian and the Laurentide ice sheets, the thing that covered the northern hemisphere. And it's said that humans migrated down through that path around 13,000 years ago and began to populate the Americas, starting in North America, moving down to Central America and then South America. However, and it's something called the Clovis Doctrine. These people were called the Clovis. It's literally named, we don't know that. It's named after the place where they found some of the arrow points and the flint tools that have a very specific shape. It's a place called Clovis, so hence the Clovis people. And we long thought that was the first population or the first peopling of the Americas. Now, since then, there has been a number of sites discovered, not only in North America, but also in Canada that really are shifting that date further and further back. There are sites like Bluefish Caves, which has evidence of human occupation some 20 to 25,000 years ago. And recently, as talked about by Graham Hancock on his excellent series, Ancient Apocalypse, White Sands in New Mexico, we're finding evidence for humans existing in the Americas many, many thousands of years prior to this, this Clovis date of some 13,000 years ago. So it seems like that whole explanation for how people got to the Americas really doesn't support the evidence that we're finding in recent decades.
And so before we go to Egypt, let's set the scene for, I think, the final issue that you attach significance to, which is Cataclysm. What you think there's been a cataclysm in relatively recent human history that has a bearing on whether we can even find evidence of these prior human civilizations that you believe potentially exist?
Indeed, and there absolutely was a cataclysmic event that occurred. There is just a massive weight of scientific evidence behind it at this point. we attribute people think about it. If probably the best way to think about this event is it was the last great extinction event to happen on this planet. And I'm not talking about the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. I'm talking about the saber-toothed tigers, the woolly mammoths, the woolly rhinos, all of these megafauna that existed in places like North and South America and Europe. Now, these animals, it was roughly 50% of what we would call megafauna, large, land-based animals. 50% of them went extinct in a very short period of time, somewhere between 15 and 12,000 years ago, and we're not really sure why. The orthodox explanation has always been human overhunting, which really doesn't make sense when you're talking about giant cave bears and the American lion, which was the size of a horse, and nomadic hunter gatherers. That there were more mammoths at that point than people by many estimations. So this, combined with a lot of recent research into essentially climate history, has shown that something catastrophic happened to the planet around 12,800, 13,000 years ago. And there's more than 150 peer-reviewed scientific papers backing this up now, looking at what you would call impact proxies. So looking through strata layers in the soil, finding high concentrations of things like extraterrestrial platinum and iridium, shock synthesized nanodiamonds. So these things that are indicative of essentially cosmic impacts. So, chunks of a disintegrating comet or meteorites, very large ones that are either bursting in the atmosphere or they're hitting the ground. Just seems to be huge amounts of evidence that something like that happened only some 12 to 13,000 years ago. Correlated with that, we also know that this was the very abrupt end of the Ice Age, of the last glaciation period. Sea levels rose in a short period of time, some nearly 300 to 400 feet, 100 meters or more, in a real short period of time. All of those, the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets, they melted, went into the oceans. So all of these things happened, and we can look back through things like ice core samples in places like Antarctica and Greenland, look at oxygen concentricities, determine things like global temperature at the time, particulate matter, and it shows that something happened 12,800 years ago. Something happened. The Earth just was plunged into this deep freeze for about 800 years. Temperatures dropped dramatically. There was massive climate change. At the same time, we have a massive megafaunal extinction. At the same time, we have sea levels rising. There are indications that during this time, at one point, up to 10% of the biomass on the planet was on fire. Absolutely crazy. Like the sun got blocked out. I mean, there's all these indications, and it all points to the most likely scenario being just a cataclysmic bombardment of the planet from space.
So it's fair to say we are at the moment in mainstream science locked into a paradigm, a doctrine, if you like. I love the way they use the word doctrine for Clovis doctrine, because it suggests they're somewhat doctrinaire. This is in defiance of the evidence that you and others like Graham Hancock point to, that essentially there must have been some kind of organised human society to make the artefacts that we see.
Indeed.
You believe that this is strong evidence that before this younger Dryas cataclysm, around about 12,800 years ago, there was some kind of advanced human civilization that was making these kind of advanced technologies, and that these technologies were in all likelihood recovered by whatever civilization followed.
Yes, that's a summary. That's what I think we're looking at when we look at places like the Sacred Valley of Peru, or we look at places like ancient Egypt. I think that explanation of inheritance and of longer timelines makes much more sense of the evidence than the Orthodox story does. I mean,
why is there such doctrinaire obduracy to that notion? I mean, I've followed Graham Hancock's story with great interest, and I love his work. And the thing that really strikes me is, whatever you think of his work, he grounds it in as much solid science as he can find. And he really cops it from establishment archaeology. I mean, they're even trying to get him gagged.
Indeed, yes. He's been the recipient of just these, just terrible attacks on his character and all sorts of ad hominems and kind of how best to put this sort of liberal kind of dog whistling terms, calling him racist and xenophobic and all these terrible things, which is nonsense. I mean, I've known Graham for years as well. He's one of the kindest, just gentlest people you'll ever meet. He's a wonderful human being.
Well, I always thought the racist
he's definitely been attacked
because he's married to a Somali woman, isn't he? I mean, it always
it
struck
was
me as
Santa.
utterly absurd. Yeah,
Indeed, yes. She's actually, I think she's Malaysian originally, but yes,
right.
he's definitely not a racist. That's for sure. And in fact, he cops a lot of this flack, and in a lot of cases, he's literally reporting what other archaeologists and anthropologists have written in terms of things, these legends of Quetzalcoatl and these other things that they say, well, it's this idea that you're taking away this, the indigenous people's culture. It's literally the stories they told that is also reported by other archaeologists, but because he's alternative, he gets attacked for it, where all these other guys are saying the same thing aren't getting attacked. However, as to why this is going on, I think there's a couple of reasons for it. One is, I think it's a reaction to the shifting of the modern media landscape, the rise of the internet, and the ability for people to do independent research and to get their message out. It's in some ways doing a bit of an end run around what has always been the old boys club of explorers clubs and universities, which is where these discussions used to take place. And in fact, if you look at archaeologists and explorers of previous generations, we're talking about the last century, the 19th century, they were very much more open to the mystery and understanding where they couldn't explain things they were looking at. And they were talking about that amongst their peers. And that's shifted now, where it's, you have the internet, you have social media, you have people like me or Graham that can get their message out there and make sense of it. I think there's a bit of a reaction from the gatekeepers of history, the archaeologists, the historians, in their academic ivory towers, that the rug's getting pulled out from under their feet a little bit. At the end of the day, archaeology is not like a hard science, like chemistry or physics might be. There's hypothesis, experiment, result. It doesn't really follow that. It's closer to language and art studies. It's an interpretation of a loose set of evidence, but they are deemed the expert. They're deemed the gatekeepers of this story. So when other people are threatening that, I think they interpret that as a personal attack in some way. So they respond as if they're being attacked personally. And we get some of the terrible accusations that have been levied against people like Graham Hancock. It's a natural reaction, I think, because they're feeling threatened.
I see parallels here with the work I've been doing on UAPs, because in the face of, I think, overwhelming evidence that sits in plain sight, that there is clearly an anomalous phenomenon, there is this obdurate resistance from much of the mainstream media, but certainly from mainstream science and commentators. And it's quite hilarious, because the more and more the evidence mounts, you get admissions from the Office of National Intelligence, and they still dogmatically stick to their doctrinaire positions. The parallels are uncanny.
Indeed. It really is. It happens in a lot of different branches of science and investigations. Really, one of the things I like to say, and I think I'll quote Chris Dunn, who I think originally coined the phrase, but to me it's like you wouldn't trust an archaeologist to design the chair that he's sitting on, but if it's an ancient chair, he's going to claim to be the expert on it, and that's a summary of all of the technological and engineering based evidence that we're seeing in places like ancient Egypt, and the perspectives that archaeologists have on them. In general, they're not engineers. They don't understand the intricacies of precision and stonework. They're just not playing in that field, and they routinely ignore all of the evidence that comes to us from true experts, machinists, engineers, people that can evaluate what they're looking at and talk about, the tools that the ancient Egyptians had and these primitive cultures or, ancient cultures had really can't explain the artifacts that we're looking at.
So, Ben, take me to Egypt. Let's talk about the plethora of ancient precision advanced artifacts. The schist disc, unfinished obelisks, the vases, columns, and precision boxes. Where do we start? Like, what's your favorite object that challenges the Orthodox paradigm?
Tough to pick a favorite, Ross. I would think that there's one overwhelming contradiction that becomes immediately obvious if you can see it, and then you will see it everywhere in Egypt. And this is really my favorite place to start people off with ancient Egypt. And that is to consider that in ancient Egypt, and this is if you consider the Orthodox timeline, this is a unique feature of this civilization in that the oldest stuff is always the best. It's kind of funny to look at things like the Great Pyramid and the massive stone pyramids of Giza, which are just, until you see them in person, they're really, it's impossible to capture the scale of them on film and truly appreciate them until you see them in person. But it's monumental, takes your breath away. But people shouldn't forget that these are supposedly amongst the very first pyramids ever built. And this you can extend this analogy across all these different facets of ancient Egypt. It's the oldest stuff that's the most massive, that's the most precise, that's the most difficult. And as it's like it's a civilization that started with, a Tesla, and they devolved down towards horse and carts, because the ancient Egyptian civilization existed for 3,000-4,000 years. And it's almost like they went backwards in technology. They kept building pyramids. They kept building statues. They kept making sites. But the technology just wasn't there. It's always this oldest stuff that is the best. And this applies to so many different categories. It's not funny. And it's very difficult to explain technologically from a civilization perspective.
I didn't realize until I watched your videos that a lot of the more dilapidated pyramids are actually the more modern ones, the newer ones.
Yes.
And they were made of mud brick by dynastic Egyptians.
Yes, they were. And it's a good, and I like to point at those and think that, okay, do you truly believe that they started off being able to build pyramids like the Great Pyramid, 6 million tons of stone, 2.5 million blocks of stone, including granite beams that were lifted 150 feet up in the air that weighed 80 tons. There's 2,500 tons worth of granite in the middle of that pyramid. And then they went backwards to building these things out of mud brick? Or is it more likely that they saw this artifact, it impressed them as much as it impressed us, and they learnt how to replicate it, to try and build it? These kings that came along wanted some of that for themselves. They wanted to have some of that majesty and connect themselves to this amazing culture themselves. And I think that's what we're looking at when we look at ancient Egypt. It's the same tendency of these kings, guys like Ramses II, a notorious and probably considered today the most powerful king of Egypt, or pharaoh in Egypt. He would write his name on things. He would carve his name on everything. All these massive statues, Ramses II. And oftentimes that is then said to be in the history books. Well, Ramses must have had that made. And there's a tacit acknowledgement, if you dig deep enough in some of these history books, that, well, maybe he was renaming older stuff. But that's I think the tendency and that's the trend that happened in ancient Egypt. It's an inheritance. It's a desire to connect themselves to this culture that they did through their own myths and legends, and then to just model themselves after it. And I think that explains a lot of what we're looking at in ancient Egypt.
So let's talk about Ramses. I mean, you talk about how you suspect that what he was doing was using earlier artifacts and
Indeed.
basically stamping his hieroglyph on those artifacts. One of the examples you use is at Tanis.
Oh yeah,
and there's an obelisk, and you make a point that essentially there's a piece from a broken obelisk that was reused. Can you talk to that, please?
Yeah, it's just one of my favorite examples to show people. And Tanis is one of those sites it's talked about in the Bible, a very famous site. It's been around since the Old Kingdom, potentially even before then. So, 2700 BC, 3000 BC timeframe. And it existed throughout the ancient Egyptian civilization. And on Tanis, you can find the most amazing examples and evidence for this type of inheritance and renovation and reuse of ancient artifacts. So in the case of this particular block, it was originally an obelisk that must have fallen over or broken. So they took a section of it, and then somebody used it in a wall. So it's a reuse first, it's put in a wall, and then somebody wrote on it. They inscribed these hieroglyphs on it. So there's another reuse where it's getting inscribed with hieroglyphs. And then Ramses came along, and he was very good at doing this because he would carve his name, and they were skilled at sort of carving over the top of existing hieroglyphs and carving very deep inscriptions into these obelisks. And you can literally see at the end of this piece of stone where his writing is blending in and covering up existing inscriptions. And there's this really deep cartouche of Ramses II, who was a ruler in the 19th dynasty of the New Kingdom. So you have a piece of stone that's been repurposed and reused, 3, maybe 4 times at Tanis. And, Tanis is one of my favorite sites because it also shows you some of the just mind-bending logistical achievements. There's another example of a reused piece of stone at Tanis that I think is should questions anyone idea that this was primitive people were capable of doing this. But there's a giant foot at Tanis. There's the Flinders Petrie found this back in the late 1800s, and it's this huge foot. Like the toenail is larger than my outstretched hand. Like it's the piece of foot. It's a foot of a massive granite statue, and this granite. This foot has had the ends of it carved off, and it's been repurposed as a block in a wall as well. But it was originally part of this one single piece giant statue, and there's other pieces of it at Tanis. But the amazing thing about that statue and that piece of granite is that piece of granite came from more than 1,000 kilometers away in the south of Egypt. So there was a statue here that would have weighed in excess of 1,000 tons, a single piece, and somebody transported that block from way down in Aswan in the south, 1,000 kilometers to the north in Egypt, and erected this statue. And then later on, it broke and was reused as a piece in a wall.
There's that great scene in
Crazy.
the movie Planet of the Apes. I remember watching it as a little boy. And you come to the end of the movie, and of course, apes are running the planet, and you don't quite know where these astronauts are, these human astronauts that are being chased around the planet by these apes.
Yep.
And then at the very end, they find the Statue of Liberty on a beach, a dilapidated Statue of Liberty. Just on that point, there's also the Luxor temple. There's these gigantic, huge solid granite statues that are polished. Beautifully polished, and they're surrounded by sandstone pylons, and there are glyphs inscribed onto the belt line of those gorgeous statues. What can you tell me about those statues at Luxor?
So at Luxor Temple, again, this is in the south of Egypt, typically attributed to the New Kingdom. And in fact, all the sandstone work is very much, I think that was work done by the New Kingdom Egyptians. It's worth not underestimating the capabilities of the dynastic Egyptians. They could do a lot. But there's some things that were technologically out of reach. And I think a lot of these massive granite artifacts are part of that. And you can literally see the strong evidence for renovation and reuse and later carving of artifacts in those statues. So, for example, on these statues, you have the belt line of these statues is often, that's where you'll find the glyph. Or maybe Ramses II is probably the most common one. You see it all the time. Also, his son Merenptah, his father Seti I, they did the same thing. But you can see that it's been carved, and it's been carved over the top of pre-existing features on the statue, which to me really doesn't make a lot of sense. If you are the guy, if it was always the intent to make this statue of Ramses II and to carve his name on it, you wouldn't go to the trouble of carving all of these existing features only to then have another guy come in and then roughly carve this hieroglyph over the top of those features. And you can see it very obviously. There are other examples of statues that have nothing on the belt line, like they were ones that they never got around to recarving. You can also tell from the way that these have been carved that the technology used to carve them is very primitive relative to the rest of the artifact. So the artifacts themselves, these statues and boxes and columns, are carved with the most remarkable precision. The granite is finished and polished to a level where it reflects light, like imagine the best kitchen granite slab you've ever seen. Like, that's not a natural finish for granite. You have to work very hard to get that reflective polished surface. Yet we see that surface on these just complex artifacts with curved surface and things like that. But you compare that to the glyphs and the carving of the glyphs, the carving themselves are very primitive. You can see the chisel marks. They're not polished.
But also, I think there's something about those statues at Luxor that I think is significant, and it's what you call overcuts. Can you explain that to me? What are the overcuts you believe evidence of?
So if you look closely at many of these statues, you can find this in the Egyptian Museum. On smaller statues, you can see it on the larger ones. We also see it on artifacts like obelisks. So these complex, massive granite objects have, in many cases, what is undoubtedly, I think, evidence for very powerful, likely machine-driven tools where you have overcuts where a circular saw has been run up and down this. And nobody suggests that the Egyptians were using somehow powered circular saws. We were also talking about granite. Like the mainstream explanation for how these things were cut was, well, they got some sand and some water and a piece of wood or a piece of copper, and they're just rubbing back and forth. And you can grind away at granite and do that, but it's going to take you, 2 days to make a cut this deep, or 3 days. So making overcuts.
So just explain to our audience,
difficult.
What is the official explanation for how, with the tools that we know, the Egyptian dynasties and pre-dynasty periods at that time had, what were the tools they had that modern archaeology or conventional archaeology uses to explain how those statues were supposedly crafted?
Yeah, it's they literally attribute everything to the tools that they found, which amount to copper chisels, flint chisels, and pounding stones. That's the toolkit. Like, that's pretty much it. And because this is one example of the circular logic that goes on in this space, everything must have been made by those tools because those are the tools that they found. So they just say everything is made by these tools, even when the evidence that there was a different tool is right there in the tool marks and in the artifact itself. It doesn't matter because the tools that we found are flint chisels and copper chisels and literally pounding stones, rubbing on them with sand. That's how they say everything in ancient Egypt was made. It's you got to remember, in the Old Kingdom, back in those periods of time, there's no evidence that even the Old Kingdom Egyptians even possessed the wheel. They didn't use the wheel. They didn't use pulleys. They didn't use. They dragged things on sleds. They used human horsepower. They really even didn't use too much in the way of livestock either. And we know this because the Egyptians drew these scenes on the wall. They showed us how they did things with primitive tools, and we have a lot of those primitive artifacts. We have mud brick pyramids, for example. They actually show us in the tombs of the nobles on the west bank of the Nile down at Luxor. You can find painted descriptions and scenes showing them making mud bricks and stacking them up, maybe making mud brick ramps, or they're making mud brick pyramids. What you don't find from the Egyptians, you don't see any evidence or any scenes depicting them building these massive stone artifacts. You don't see them building, 1,000-ton statues. You don't see them building these giant columns and boxes and obelisks. They don't explain that, but they do show how they made the other artifacts that we see in Egypt. In a lot of ways, when you look at Egypt, it's something I call a tale of two industries. And you can see there are artifacts and objects that are explainable by these primitive tools. And they're what you would expect. They're sort of primitive artifacts. They're very rough. And these exist alongside with a whole other category of artifacts and architecture that is anything but primitive. It's precise, it's polished, it's massive, it's megalithic, and it's not explained by the tools that the dynastic Egyptians used.
So let's talk about tube drilling. One of the things that you point to a lot is someone was able to drill extraordinarily precise round holes in solid granite, really hard rocks. Tell me how hard granite is, and tell me, what tools the Egyptians supposedly had. How does Orthodox archaeology explain these very obvious tube holes that are drilled into solid granite all around Egypt?
I find it to be one of the most fascinating mysteries in ancient Egypt, the mystery of the ancient Egyptian tubular drill holes. And we actually find these cores that come out of them as well. But they're often found made, again, on Old Kingdom sites, on the oldest sites. And they're made into stone like granite or basalt, which is, 6.5, 6 to a 7 on the Mohs scale of hardness. So, a human fingernail is maybe 2.5. Things like calcite or limestone or marble, alabaster might be a 3. Copper is around a 3. Steel is around a 6, 6.5. So you're talking about rock that is as hard as steel. And in fact, we have examples of some stones that are almost even a 9 on the Mohs scale being worked by the ancient Egyptians. Diamond is the hardest material we know of. That's a 10. So it's a scale of 1 to 10. So these are very, very hard materials. There's a reason modern sculptors work in marble. It's soft and it's homogeneous. Granite is very difficult to work in. But we find evidence for sophisticated tools being used into materials like granite and basalt. And one of these signs of sort of significant tooling is these tubular drill holes. You see they're small to large. We see them in all shapes and sizes. We find them, they're part of the Great Pyramid, for example. They're all over these Old Kingdom sites. And it's not so much the precision of them, but it's the analysis and the investigation into the tool marks themselves. So these spiral grooves that have been made into these holes, and indeed into the cores that came out of the hole. So you can think of this hollow tube cutting through the stone, and then it gets retracted, and you snap off, you remove a core of material from that hole, and you discard it. It's a piece of scrap, right? You want the hole, you don't want this core. But we found, and Flinders Petrie famously found several of these cores from these holes, and by analyzing the markings on those drill cores, you can make inferences and analyze the type of tool that was used and how fast it cut through the stone. So we know that there's these spiral grooves that show that, okay, whatever was cutting through this material, this hard material, was doing so at a very rapid rate in terms of how quickly it penetrated the stone. In fact, the rate of penetration into the stone is something like 500 times greater than we can achieve today with our modern tools. The tool might have been turning slowly, but it's penetrating into the stone very rapidly. It's very difficult to explain.
Has anyone ever been able to replicate the kind of drill holes that you're talking about that are cut into solid granite all around Egypt?
I mean, not with the same tool marks. We can cut that material, no problem. I mean, we have, silicon carbide tipped drills, and we can ceramic drills and things that we can cut that stone and work it, no problem, with our big powered drills.
But I'm talking about the technology that
no.
Orthodox archaeology says we had 5,500 years ago.
No. So the Orthodox explanation for these tubular drill holes is that they took a copper tube and they put some sand on it, and they got a bow drill, and they went back and forth. And look, that works. You will slowly, using sand, because sand has corundum and bits of quartz in it, flint, and it'll very slowly grind away at the granite. And it takes days and days and days to get this far into the granite. And those experiments have been done. So there was Dennis Stocks is an experimental archaeologist who did this. The difference is that the result of what you get, and this has been studied a few times, it looks nothing like the examples we see in Egypt. Can you grind through stone very slowly with that method? Yes. But the result and what you get looks nothing like what we see in Egypt. It doesn't have these same deep spiral grooves that are indicative of the power of the tool. You end up with this nice polished surface. Actually, as you might imagine, you're just really rubbing on this thing with sand, and it's just slowly grinding away the copper too at the same rate. It really wears those tools out. So yes, you can use primitive methods to grind away at granite, but it just looks, the problem I have with it is that it looks nothing like what we see in Egypt, which is, we see evidence for some sort of extremely powerful tool, potentially using a technology that we don't possess or that we don't use, things like maybe ultrasonics or thermal technologies or something. Because again, even with our most powerful tools that spin really fast and they can cut the material, it's just not penetrating the stone at the same rate. The tools and the cut lines in Egypt show that drill could penetrate through the stone 500 times at a 500 times greater rate than what we can do with our modern tools today. So it might have been going slowly. I mean, Petrie documented this, right? He said it's a 1 in 60. So if you unwind that tool mark, that circular tool mark in a straight line, so for 60 inches of horizontal travel, it's penetrating 1 inch of vertical travel in a circular form. So that's 500 times greater than what our tools can do today. And that's a real mystery. Like, it's very difficult to explain.
So,
but the marks are there.
The obvious evidence there is right in your face. There was clearly some kind of advanced civilization that we don't know about that was using mechanized tools.
Yeah, and of what form that took, I don't know. We've never found the tools. Like, that's always, and it's a legitimate question that comes up. So where are the tools? We don't know. We have the evidence for the tools, we have the marks from the tools, but we haven't found the tools. I mean, not for nothing, and it's a whataboutism, but even the mainstream explanation of saying, well, it was a copper tube and they used sand, they've also never found a single copper tube from ancient Egypt. So there's the where are the tools question applies equally well to the mainstream explanation. However, the result of those tools, and we've done the experiments with it, it just doesn't look like anything like what we see in ancient Egypt. There was a different tool involved, and the evidence is there for anyone that wants to go and look at it. You can look at the holes in Egypt, the scans, and the evidence has been documented by several engineers. You can visit the Petrie Museum in London and book a research appointment. You can look at Petrie's drill core and analyze it yourself. It's undeniable. It's 100% a spiral groove, and it just isn't explained by these primitive tools that the archaeologists say were used.
So just continuing this theme, in the early 1850s, there was an archaeologist, Auguste Mariette, who discovered this incredible series of discoveries at a place called Saqqara, these Serapeum boxes. Why are these Serapeum boxes so incredible?
It's probably my favorite site is the Serapeum of Saqqara. This is an astonishing site. And if you ever find yourself visiting Egypt and visiting Saqqara, which is a vast necropolis, the step pyramid of Saqqara, you can spend days and days and days at Saqqara. I would not miss the Serapeum. It's an underground labyrinth of these massive galleries and chambers. That's all rock cut. It's cut into the bedrock. It wasn't constructed like the roof is bedrock, so it's a tunnel system. But inside this, these massive galleries and chambers, you will find 25 of the most remarkable artifacts I've ever seen. And these are single-piece stone boxes, for want of a better term. The mainstream calls them sarcophagi. Very hard stone. Yeah, granite, diorite, syenite, all sorts of types of incredibly hard stone. But what's amazing about the Serapeum is just the sheer scale of them. These things weigh, with their lids, up to around 100 tons. So the body of the box itself is 70 tons, and the lid might be 30. And there's 25 of them down there. Like, it's, for some reason, and they've been moved in there, and they're shaped and made with, in some cases, just remarkable precision, like perfect 90-degree corners, flat surfaces and planes. It's a remarkable engineering achievement to manufacture one of these boxes. And
just to underline this, obviously we could do it, but what would it take today to cut that granite and that diorite in the way that you see in those Serapeum boxes at Saqqara?
So the question has been asked. A good friend of mine and the author of several books, Christopher Dunn, had asked a granite manufacturing company, like, could you make one of these boxes? And they said, yes. I mean, the cost would be astronomical just to get the raw piece of granite. And the only way they could do it, though, would be to basically cut 5 slabs and bolt it together, which is not what we see in the Serapeum. These are single-piece stone boxes. They're not slabs that are bolted together. They've been hollowed out. For us to do this today, I mean, you're talking millions of dollars probably for the rough piece of granite. Try moving a 100-ton load over any road as well. Like, you need all sorts of permits. It's extremely difficult and expensive to move that sort of load around. And then we would have to create custom tools to actually cut that stone out, and it would just be prohibitively expensive to do. Can it be done, and do we have the technology to do it? Yes, but it would take everything we've got, and then forget about trying to move these things into an underground chamber, because at some point somebody did this, that 25 times. They moved 100-ton boxes into an underground labyrinth, in some cases with less than a foot of clearance. The biggest boxes only fit through the passages by about a foot. Like, that's the clearance you've got. You've got to turn the corner, and then these boxes are put into these alcoves they're perfectly centered in these alcoves that exist off this giant, massive gallery that's so big you could, drive a Volkswagen down it. But they put into these alcoves. They're lowered down about 6 feet and put in the exact center of these alcoves, and they're kind of parked there. And that's where we find them today. I mean, honestly, the only reason they're not in the museum is because we can't get them out of there.
You mentioned Chris Dunn, and I love some of Chris Dunn's work because he has the pragmatic attitude of an engineer. He just looks at something like an engineer looks at something and tries to figure out how the hell you would build it. And to me, one of the greatest examples of this incredible mystery about ancient Egyptian technologies is the head of Ramses. Talk to me about the head of Ramses and the work particularly that Chris Dunn did.
Yes, I'm a massive fan of Chris Dunn. I'm very privileged to be able to call him a good friend as well now. I've spent a lot of time with Chris. And yeah, I'm a huge fan of his work. In fact, he's responsible for getting me into this space in a lot of ways. And he has done what I genuinely think his work in the future will go down as just game changing. He brings a lot of evidence to the table. And one of the things that he looked at that is truly fascinating was he did a symmetry analysis on the head of this Ramses statue, one of these giant statues at Luxor. It's like, 30, 40 feet tall, this giant big head.
Hundreds of
In
tons.
Well, it's the statue itself. Yeah, it means maybe a couple hundred tons is probably in that range. Certainly, there's bigger statues. However, this head is unique in that it was on the ground, so it's not anymore. It's not there anymore. But for a long time, it was sitting on the ground at front of Luxor Temple, so you could actually get up close to it and look at it, and it was very well preserved. And so what Chris did was he took a study on looking at how symmetrical is this head and is this face. Used a few techniques. One of my favorites was this reverse transparency overlay that he shows, where if you get that dead on center line, you can take a photograph of it, and then you make a copy of the photograph, and then you flip it on that vertical axis, so it's inverse, and then you overlay it on the original photograph, make them both transparent, 50% transparent, so you can then determine, you can look at the features, the differences in features from left to right. And it's basically perfect. I'd love to see it scanned with modern tools and 3D scanning technology to really determine this. However, by all accounts and from that sort of evidence, it looks perfectly symmetrical, which is just utterly remarkable, particularly when you're talking about something that is really three-dimensional. You're looking at it on a flat plane, but achieving that level of symmetry is absolutely an aspect of precision and machine precision. Like you cannot do this by hand. I've seen Michelangelo's David. I mean, it makes you weep. It's incredible artwork, but it's not symmetrical. It's also made from marble, much softer than granite. This thing's made from granite. Symmetry is not a characteristic of human faces either. We all have different sized eyeballs and nostrils. So it's not reflecting artwork. It's not something that you can achieve by hand. This face and this statue had to have been both designed and then likely executed with some machine-like precision to achieve this level of symmetry. It's simply not explainable with hand tools or with just by artwork. It's not something that exists in artwork. Symmetry is an aspect of precision,
So
and
how does
precision.
Orthodox archaeology explain that, Ben?
They don't. They really ignore it. I mean, most of this sort of engineering-oriented evidence that is brought up by people like engineers who aren't in the academic disciplines of archaeology, mostly it gets ignored. In the few occasions where archaeologists have attempted to explain the engineering achievements of the dynastic Egyptians, any scrutiny of their explanations just turn out to be ridiculous. For example, we talked about tubular drills, and I thought this was remarkable. This was so in one of the mainstream technology Egyptology books that was written by archaeologists. They, for the longest time, and to this day, will refuse to admit that there are, in fact, spiral grooves on this core. And that's the spiral groove is what indicates that it's, penetrating the stone. They will tell you, no, it's circular, striations. It's just like it's a result of this rubbing mechanism. And they went to the point of, in that textbook, they have a photo of Petrie's core number 7, and Chris Dunn showed that they actually took that photo and they just tilted it. They tilted the photo to make the striations look horizontal on the page. I mean, so instead of acknowledging it, they're literally just saying it's not spiral, and here's a picture of it. You can see it's horizontal, but it's as if you took like a screw, a modern bolt with an obvious thread pitch on it, and you tilted it, and so those thread pitches look horizontal. They did the exact same thing in the textbook with Petrie's core number 7. So they ignore it, and when they do offer up explanations, there's some explanation for things like the stone cutting of massive slabs. It's so ridiculous, it's laughable from an engineering perspective. And those are the sort of topics I get into.
So, Ben, I could go on all day, and I think we should wrap up fairly soon. But one of the
Sure.
things I want to finish with is probably one of the smallest, and I know it's one of your favorites. Take me to the diorite vase, very small diorite, squat little vase in the Cairo Museum. Tell me what diorite is, how hard it is, and what you see in that object.
So diorite is it's one of the many forms of very hard igneous rock. It's diorite's typically a little bit harder than granite. There's 1,000 different names for the types of stones in that range of material. The ancient Egyptians, whoever made artifacts from these materials, used lots of different types of these very hard pieces of stone. One of the challenges of this type of material is that it's not homogeneous. It's made up. There's hornblende and mica and quartz and silica and all these different materials in that matrix, this aggregate that forms in over millions of years of heat and pressure that forms into stone. So it means that when you're working that surface, you're going from materials microscopically from materials that are softer to materials that are harder. So it's a very challenging stone to work. And there are examples of diorite vases and bowls and artifacts that just show just utter mastery of stone. They're utter, and it's been machined with just this incredible precision. In fact, there are examples of vessels that have machined that type of diorite down to something like 1/40th of an inch thick, which is less than almost a little more than half a millimeter thick in places, and it's translucent. The light shines through it. Yeah, I mean, Flinders Petrie documented this this isn't under no means is this a modern forgery. Flinders Petrie documented this sort of stuff in the late 1800s, and he was blown away by it. And it's incredible manufacturing and just precision in these things, and we're
Could we
shining a
make
light
it?
on some of that.
Could we make it today? I mean, could we cut
I
a
mean,
vase like that out of diorite today?
probably. I think we do have the capability, but nobody's done it because it's prohibitively expensive. It would take a lot more than our regular stone cutting tools. It would take aerospace grade 5-axis mills that are going to be burning through tooltips at a prodigious rate because of the material, and it would just be insanely expensive to do.
But
And for what?
I think the thing that really startled me about a lot of these vases that you're talking about is a lot of them have lugs on the outside.
They
So
do.
the lugs would get in the way of a lathe, even assuming that the Egyptians had lathes, which is an open question. I suspect they didn't.
Yeah.
But how on earth would you craft to such thinness and such fineness the detail in a vase like that if you didn't have a lathe? What's the technology they've
Well,
used?
so that's it's one of the interesting parts about the vase investigation or the vase scan investigation is that the goalposts have shifted here because for a long time, I mean, this is an example 3D replica of one of these vessels, and as you said, there are these lug handles on the side of it, and for the longest time, people thought, well, these are all just handmade, and the investigation into precision and the machining and the geometry of them has said that it's now shifted where people are saying, well, okay, maybe the Egyptians made them on lathes, but they were on primitive lathes, and you can make them with a lathe. And in a lot of cases, these lug handles show that that's actually not possible. You can imagine this if you take away the lug handle, you can see how this might have been turned on a lathe, like you're spinning on a
Sure.
lathe and you're carving it, but you can't explain the lug handles with a lathe. You would have to leave a bullnose that runs all the way around the vase, and then you would have to come back with another tool and remove that excess material, the stuff that exists between the lug handles. And it's one of the details of the vase scan work has shown that however they did there's no perceivable loss of precision when it comes to the lug handles, which is something that we struggle with in our own manufacturing systems today. So that you lose positional calibration when you do tool changes. You expect a degree of loss in precision. We account for that in how we manufacture aerospace parts, jet engine components, rocket engine components, and that's part of it. But we don't see that in these artifacts. We don't see that loss of precision of capability. So what that means is that either they could handle that loss of positional calibration and deal with it better than we can, or this wasn't made on a lathe. And if it wasn't made on a lathe, the only other tool that exists that can make something like this requires 5 axes of freedom, and we call those things, 5-axis mills. And now we're talking about these giant, big robotic arms with tools that can cut at different angles, and it's all controlled by robotics. That's the only way you can explain the precision on these artifacts. It's the only thing that we have that's even remotely capable of doing something like this is a 5-axis mill that works on aerospace parts.
And yet we're talking about objects that are at least 4,000 to 5,000 years old.
Oh, at least. I mean, yes, the youngest ones of these are probably in that range. I suspect that they're far, far older than that, and that they've been inherited and they've been found with people that we then date as being 4,000 or 5,000 years old. It's tough to explain. It's fascinating. I think there's tremendous evidence that there was something very sophisticated going on long ago, and it's not explained by the ancient civilizations as we know it. And when you combine that with the evidence for cataclysm, the extension of the human timeline, every culture around the world talking about, origin stories involving massive floods or fire and conflagrations and ancestors that could do advanced things, but they were wiped out. All of a sudden, this idea that there was indeed an ancient civilization on this planet, they had some significant capability, and then they were wiped out, and we're looking at the remnants of what they left behind. I think that starts to make a lot more sense. I think it's a better interpretation of the evidence that's out there.
Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. Just by way of interest, how did an Aussie boy get into this esoteric subject? What drew you into this arcane area?
Well, I have to give some credit. My mother was a history teacher, so I always had a strong interest in history. But honestly, I mean, I went in the IT computer direction at university, but I have to credit Graham Hancock for this. I was a big fan of his, and in 2013, I had the chance to spend 2 weeks with him traveling around Peru and Bolivia. And as you might imagine, his perspective on those things sort of opens up your mind. I had no idea about most of the mysteries that exist when it comes to the topic of ancient lost civilizations. And then I literally did the same thing in 2015. I spent 2 weeks with Graham in Egypt. And I met Zahi Hawass, and I met guys like Muhammad Ibrahim and Yusuf Ayawan. And that just blew my mind. And it's like I literally, a year and a half after that, I quit my day job to try and pursue this full time. I was entirely obsessed with these mysteries and the obvious contradictions in the story of history, and I couldn't really think about anything else. So I kept going back to Egypt. And I'm very thankful that people have enjoyed the content that I've put out, and that it makes sense with them. And I've had tremendous opportunities to meet people like yourself, like Graham, Randall Carlson, guys like that over time, and Chris Dunn. And it's been quite a ride. I love doing it.
Well, Ben, I love your show, and I think the work you're doing is incredibly important. Ben van Kirkwyk, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with Reality Check, and I look forward to having you on again sometime soon, because I could talk to you all day.
Thank you very much, Ross. It's been a pleasure to be on the show, and cheers.
Thanks, mate. Hello, and welcome to Reality Check. Before we start, I want to tell you a little bit about our sponsor for this week. It's the iconic Chuck Norris, a guy I used to have on my bedroom wall. The martial artist hero who's still in his 80s and still kicking butt and still staying active. What's even more shocking is he's stronger, he can work out longer, and he even has plenty of energy left over for his grandkids. He did this by making just one change, and he says he still feels like he's in his 50s. His wife even started doing this one thing too, and she's never felt better. She says she feels 10 years younger, her body looks leaner, and she has energy all day. Chuck made a special video that explains everything. Make sure you watch it by going to chuckdefense.com/Ross. That's this link below this video. It will change the way you think about your health. Once again, that's chuckdefense.com/Ross. Now, let's get on and enjoy the show. So, well, meet JP Haig, my good friend, a lawyer from Mauritius, who also happens to have an interest in the esoteric. Where are we, JP?
Well, Roscoe, it doesn't take a million guesses to find out that we are outside Menkaure Pyramid
So, let's get in there, JP.
Let's do it, Ross. I have the ticket.
Hello and welcome back to Reality Check. So as you know, I've been gallivanting around ancient Egypt's ruins for the past few weeks, and it's been a blast. And my colleague on that journey has been our guest today, JP Haig. JP is a lawyer of renown. He used to work for a big posh law firm in London, and he moved to the beautiful tropical island of Mauritius in the middle of the Indian Ocean, where he began his intense interest in the esoteric, including many trips to Egypt that has heightened his understanding of what lies behind the incredible advanced technologies that are clearly revealed in the ruins and gorgeous art that you see scattered along the length of the Nile. JP, welcome to Reality Check.
Thank you, Ross. Thank you for having me.
Tell me a little bit about yourself. How did you get into, I know you're very interested in the subject of UAPs as well, unidentified anomalous phenomena, and you're also fascinated with ancient Egypt and the mysteries behind that. Do you think there's a link between the two?
I certainly do. I first had my encounter with UAP back in late 2009 or the first quarter of 2010 while I was living and lawyering in London. And it showed me that there was a direct link between mental activity and thoughts and the appearance of UAP, which take a physical appearance. So I'm walking back from, I went to the cinema, I'm walking back over St. John's Wood, which is a beautiful part of London, on a hill. I'm looking towards a place called Notting Hill, which has been made famous through the film with Hugh Grant. And I'm thinking to myself at a time that I'm researching the subject, is this real or not? And as soon as I think those thoughts, a diamond metallic shaped object appears over the London skyline and pulses in and out of visibility or reality several times, and it reflects the sunlight. So it took a physical form, and it was almost certainly in response to my thoughts.
So do you think that UAPs are actually physical craft of a non-human intelligence?
I think that they, based on my research and what I know and what I've seen, I think the answer is yes, but I think they may come from a non-local time or space, let's say. I think that they can transfer into this reality and take physicality, but clearly from what I saw, they are also extremely capable of cloaking or what's called dematerializing.
Okay. A lot of people will be watching this and they'll be going, okay, this is all very narcissistic. You know, this guy thinks he was able to summon a UFO. Why do you think it was responding to your expression of intention?
I don't know. I think that based on the experiencer type data, there are individuals that are intimately, close to the subject and have ongoing interactions. And I think that it started at a time when I was actually highly skeptical of the subject. I was shown purported kind of footage or imagery from a so-called classified deep space satellite that was showing these almost ethereal outlines of objects or craft in space. And I just rubbished it. I said, this is obviously photoshopped and, this isn't really evidence.
Has that vision or that imagery, by the way, ever surfaced publicly?
It was on a YouTube channel, and I've since really tried to find it, but there's nothing there. I can't find it.
But do you now believe it was authentic?
I'm not sure, but I think it really strongly correlates with all the things that we're learning.
So let's assume that there is a non-human intelligence of some kind manifesting itself to people like you who express an intention and a desire to engage with it. Why the hell would an NHI want to talk to JP Haig?
I don't know. I think it's probably to do with advancing the understanding of this subject, like yourself, Ross. I think that unless we have direct experience, which is a really important underlying point within the esoteric sciences, we don't truly understand. We can have all the books and data in the world, but unless we actually taste the experiential, we will never fully understand.
So it's twigging our consciousness.
It's exactly, it's moving our understanding through interest and titillating us through these experiences, but it's also highly elusive.
So why not be more overt? Why not just land on the White House lawn, as the popular saying suggests it should?
Maybe whatever these NHIs are, or whoever they are, they have a better understanding of us than we do. And maybe something of that nature would trigger panic or widespread alarm. And frankly, based on how we see debunkers acting, they would just probably set this aside and say it's a fake event anyway. So you can't win. You're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't.
So how does this all relate to Egypt? How did you get involved in the study of ancient Egypt?
Well, I, at a distance, was looking at what some of the depictions in the temples were suggesting. I'm thinking about how were they able to construct these megalithic marvels, frankly, with geometric information encoded in them, based on the understanding that we have today and the tools that they would have had back then. And it was incredible. And I just think that in order to understand where we are and where we're going, we need to look backwards in time first. And it seems quite clear to me that there is a relationship between the pre-dynastic period in Egypt and the understanding of construction methods and movement of materials and their placement, the types of materials that are used and their alignment astronomically with this UAP phenomenon, which I've experienced and is now the subject, obviously, of a US government push for disclosure.
So on our final night on the Giza Plateau, we had the most incredible experience where we were given private access to the Great Pyramid of Giza. You've only got to walk around the Great Pyramid of Giza and you realise what an incredible feat it was for an ancient civilization to build a structure like this. It's absolutely massive. And not only is it massive, it's perfect. The sides are perfect. The proportions are perfect. The straight lines around the side are perfect. It's been done by somebody with a very precise mathematical mind. And yet we're meant to believe that this was a pre-dynastic or on-dynastic Egyptian civilization that didn't have the wheel, didn't have anything other than copper tools. It beggars belief that a civilization like that was responsible for building this gigantic object. Talk me through why you think the Great Pyramid of Giza is a good illustration of the extraordinarily advanced technologies that you think lie behind the mysteries of ancient Egypt.
I mean, look, first of all, let's look at how it's positioned. It is on the longitudinal north axis that happens to coincide with the exact speed of light, which is something like 299,792,000 odd meters per second.
Wow, so whoever it was that built the pyramid knew the speed of light.
Well, scientists will say that's a coincidence.
It's a hell of a coincidence.
Is it a coincidence that the three pyramids of Giza taken together almost perfectly match or overlay the three stars of Orion's belt, Al-Nitak, Al-Nilam, and Mintaka, the smallest pyramid, which is Menkaure pyramid? They're not precisely overlaying, but in relation to the smallest pyramid, but the pattern is so strong it would be almost arrogant to deny that there is a strong correlation. So there is a link between the cosmological location or reflection of the skies onto the ground. And also, if we think about the precession of the equinoxes, which is the wobble of the Earth, how is it that the geometry of the pyramid, if you take certain lengths and divide or multiply by the height, you get this figure of 25,000 or 920 years odd, which is a full wobble of the Earth. And you have 2,500 odd years for each zodiacal sign through which the wobble passes. So, I mean, incredible astronomical knowledge and positioning of this object, let alone how it was built.
The thing that blows me away as somebody who's tried to make something very basic at my home recently, it involved a lot of levelling with building sand. I can't believe how level the granite slabs are under and around the Great Pyramid of Giza. They are perfectly level after thousands of years. Whoever built it really knew what they were doing.
They did, and the pyramid is actually constructed on a mound. People think that, there was an underground, flat leveling, but they actually built over the mound and somehow managed to keep it stable and look where it is and how it's, standing up today.
I wonder if there's any building on this planet that will still be around in, at least 5,500 years, which is the official date, around 5,500 years, that they suggest was the beginning of the pharaohic dynasties, and that the pyramids were built somewhere within that dynasty period. Do you believe the pyramids were built by the pharaohs?
No, I don't. I think there is far too much controversy around how they're associated with the kings of Khufu, Khafren, and Menkaure. There was a gentleman, or so-called gentleman, from the British Archaeological Society. He was a colonel. His name was Howard Vyse. And he was the guy that basically came in and allegedly found a cartouche of King Khufu inside the pyramid. But the problem is that the cartouche is inaccurate and it's been very poorly done. And that is the evidence that is based this naming of the Great Pyramid throughout time.
One of the things that amused me was you pointed out that practically everything in Egypt that is beautiful and exotic has the name of Ramses II on it. He literally went around writing his name on everything when he was pharaoh, didn't he? And that's the date that's used. His name is used to date so many of these objects. You believe that the pyramids weren't built in the period of the pharaohs, which is roughly from 5,500 years ago. Why do you believe that?
I think that the astronomical knowledge just alone and the geometry that's encoded into these pyramids just is beyond the capacities of the times of the kings.
Because what we know from the archaeological record is that the civilization that existed during the period of the pharaohs only developed copper tools quite a few dynasties in. It didn't have copper tools in the early part of the pharaohic dynasties. And those copper tools, I don't think you could cut a lump of granite as accurately as some of those beautiful lumps of granite are cut to make statues, beautifully honed 90-degree angle stone blocks. How can we explain how those blocks were cut, how those gorgeous statues were cut?
It's difficult because the evidence is thin on the ground, literally. And what we do have are depictions across various temples. I'm thinking of Dendera and Edfu and Abydos, which seem to suggest that there was some form of levitational capacity to lift the blocks, to raise the temple off the ground, and to put them in place. We're not saying that these are literally depictions of people that were doing this throughout the dynastic period, but you see these energetic type rods and energy lines that are basically like dots that are not connected like a lasso, raising these objects off of the ground.
And they are represented on the hieroglyphs as if the temple's being lifted off the ground.
That's right. It's almost like a sequence of events or depictions where you see the temple firmly on the ground. Then you see them, for example, being raised with these energetic rods. You see the arms of these netters, these creatures or beings with their arms raised with the rods, and they're lifting them off the ground.
Here we are in Edfu Temple. It's quite special. It's also crowded. Beautiful sandstone walls covered with incredible hieroglyphics, including hieroglyphics of what looks like a temple being levitated.
So you think that this is a literal representation of the Egyptians using levitation?
Yeah, because if you remember the scene outside, the dots were not connected.
Yeah.
Okay, and also the whole temple was still on the ground. Why they made it over the ground here? Why it's became like one cable surrounding the whole temple and the dots are being connected, okay? It refers that the fields of energy are connected now and the process is happening, which is levitation, okay? I didn't believe in that and I was thinking it was like a kind of levitating the energy of the temple. So it's most symbolizing the whole spiritual feeling inside the temple, okay?
What does conventional Egyptology suggest that that's representing?
Well, they are saying that it's stretching a cord around the temple, okay? And it comes just after pouring the water and also putting the foundation's offerings. But we can notice that the temple here is complete.
So who were they?
We can't be sure, but if we look at the Temple of Edfu, for example, when we were cruising down the Nile, Ross, we can see these obsessive compulsive depictions of very tall, large beings or netters coming across to Egypt in boats. Boats obviously were used on the high seas and on the Nile, but why so big? Why so many beings inside them? Why depicting the transition from west to east? And is this speaking of an Atlantean type civilization?
So you're talking here about the lost city of Atlantis, which we're told is mythology. It's not true. It's just a story.
For sure, but there are other myths as well of different island, let's say, civilizations all around the world. Look at Mauritius, where I'm from, for example. We say that we hear about this civilization of Lemuria. Lemuria is a Malgache, a Madagascan word. It means souls of the departed. So we can locate this through the etymological, analysis of the language. We also know that there's been studies of island groups around Mauritius or submerged islands, and they would have been above the water's level at one point in time. So, there is evidence for island-type conglomerate areas on the Earth that are a bit different. The gravitational waves are a bit different around this part of the world, and the Earth's crust is much thicker than the average location.
So let's go through some of the specifics that we've seen during our trip. I think very early on, walking through the museum in Cairo, you see these gorgeous statues made out of carved diorite granite, a beautiful, deep, black, polished granite. And I don't know how a civilization that at best only had copper tools or bronze tools, and very early on only had stone tools, how could you possibly make a statue that beautiful with that kind of technology?
You simply can't, and granite or rose granite and diorite are harder than steel on the relevant scale. So we know that they couldn't do it with copper tools to that degree and to
So what
achieve that level of
explanation is
perfection.
given? What explanation is given by conventional Egyptology to explain this?
It is the use of these tools. I mean, that's as far as I can tell, and just hewing and using of the use of rocks to smash.
But that's nonsense.
It is nonsense. It sort of flies in the face of common sense. And the best example of this, Ross, as you'll recall, is probably the unfinished obelisk of Aswan.
So here's one of the biggest mysteries of all, what's called the unfinished obelisk in Aswan in southern Egypt. It's the quarry where all the red granite that was found further north came from. We don't know how they got that granite up the Nile River, and we sure as hell don't know how they moved objects as large as this one. Have a look at this. This is the unfinished obelisk. It's absolutely massive, carved out of one lump of granite. It's absolutely gigantic. It still sits embedded in the granite bedrock, and it's enormous. The cuts are almost 90 degrees accurate, and when you look very closely, like look here, you can see what look like scoop marks in the granite. Now nobody can really explain where those scoop marks came from. They're sure as hell not explained by men with stone adzes. It's a mystery that nobody has ever been able to solve. So JP, I see a gigantic lump of granite, an almost incomprehensibly large lump of granite. It must be hundreds and hundreds of tons.
Yep, it's a mystery that something so large can be shaped, sculpted, and effectively excavated from this rose granite, which is harder than steel. And the only evidence that we're being given is that hard rocks were used over hundreds of years.
I think that's hilarious.
It is funny.
Using hard rocks to chip away something as accurate as this unfinished obelisk.
Yeah, I think this is beyond 2001: A Space Odyssey. I think advanced tooling was used. My speculation would be sonic tools that could effectively resonate the granite at such a high frequency that it would probably been disintegrated into dust and it being layered, which could explain why you see these kind of ice cream scoop marks, which are so smooth and perfect. And of course, then the problem is, imagine that this obelisk was actually extracted and it was perfectly cut underneath, there were no breakages and so on, although we see a crack at the top, and that's the explanation given as to why the project failed and was left as it is. But then how do you erect this thing? How do you transport it without it being damaged or broken? What kind of manpower and transport would have been used?
Well, I think our guide's explanation was more plausible, that crack in the rock is actually an attempt by dynastic Egypt to cut a slab out of the granite.
That's right. It's to
make smaller ones out of the big one.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It's a complete.
The drill holes are like at this angle that might make a triangle, like a pointed top.
Have you noticed all the punch marks, the regular punch marks everywhere in the stone? That also seems to have been part of the technique.
This is to lower the level, so you sort of have a step level down to the main event.
I guess the other question is, how on earth would they have lifted something as large as this out of this quarry and transported it up the river to wherever they wanted to move it?
Exactly, and when you think about it, the depictions in Edfu Temple on the Nile, in Komombo, and indeed even in Dendera Temple, the Temple of Hathor, where we see this these beings, these kings, effectively using some kind of energy lines that lift or raise the temple. In one image, you can see the temple is affixed to the ground. In the next image, you see a field around the temple, and it's depicted as being lifted from the ground.
So you think they had levitation?
It would make sense. The only question is how. Where you go into the museum, you're shown an interesting video by the former Antiquities Minister, Dr. Zahi Hawass, and the suggestion is made that these smaller rocks were physically smashed, almost like something out of the beginning of 2001 Space Odyssey, and that's how they extracted or hewed the rose granite from the quarry, creating these perfectly smooth, like scoop marks where the material was extracted from.
That's the thing. When you and I were clambering down underneath that gigantic unfinished obelisk, not only is it, frankly, it's a huge object. I don't know how, even if they had been able to cut it, a civilization that ancient would have been able to lift what was probably, 1,500, 2,000 tons in weight. I mean, you'd need cranes, you'd need machinery, you'd need something to lift it out, wouldn't you?
Exactly. You need to have either a mechanical capacity and hydraulics in order to lift this thing up without snapping it, because it's 36 or 38 meters in length. It weighs God knows how many tons. And there's a huge risk in the work being a complete waste of time if you're not using these careful techniques.
So that's one baffling mystery associated with the unfinished obelisk. But then when you go underneath and clamber underneath, as we did, you see quite extraordinary scoop marks in the granite. This is solid granite, a really hard rock, one of the hardest rocks on the planet. What do you see, JP?
It's a great point, Ross, and I think what you do see are almost like scrapes of like butter or ice cream that's been scooped from a box, and that's just not possible through smashing rocks. It's certainly not possible through chiseling or even the use of something harder like steel. It's incredible. I would say that...
So what was it? What were they doing?
My theory or impression is that there was some kind of acoustic technology that would resonate at a certain frequency, or the frequency of the granite, and it would almost pulverize it into dust.
So why haven't we discovered that technology today? I mean, that's something that's not known to our civilization if such a technology exists.
I mean, we always talk about lost civilizations and lost knowledge, and I think this probably falls into that category. I'm not saying I'm right, but it's an impression that I had from maybe 5 years ago, and I've heard others like Ben Van Kerwick from Uncharted X also have this idea. I mean, the way I got this idea was it was just like a flash. I just had this imagery in my head when I went to the site of these kind of tools that were being used. You could hear the sound, I don't know how they would have been powered. You know, the battery hadn't been invented then, according to you know, what we know or think we know today. But it would make sense because it would almost render the extraction and the polishing effortless.
The thing that leaps out at me is how even our guide, Ahmed, was making reference to what seemed to be a catastrophe that hit the world around about 12,800 years ago. And he very clearly believes that there was a civilization that predated the so-called Younger Dryas catastrophe, whatever it was. Might have been a comet, a meteor, or some kind of solar event. Either way, the archaeological record shows that there was a devastating impact on planet Earth. And the interesting thing is, in the same place where we found the unfinished obelisk, there's a kind of a quarry area where there are gigantic lumps of granite that appear to have been thrown asunder. And right there amongst them is the most incongruous object of all. It looks like Doctor Who's TARDIS. Talk me through it.
So yes, we're talking about Elephantine Island, which is a really mysterious place. And you can see a lot of, there are temple structures that came well after in the dynastic period. There's an association on one cartouche with Thutmose III, which is Menkaperra. And it is a beautiful location on the Nile. You progress into the site, and as you say, Ross, there is an area where there seems to be at least some form of localized disaster or energetic type event where enormous megalithic blocks, even granite boxes of diorite and rose granite, have been projected across the site, and they're lying on their side. What's interesting here is that the boxes are, as you say, perfectly cut, 90-degree angles. And what often is missed on the specific box that we're talking about is there seems to be a perfectly, I don't know, a black line that is just as straight as they come. And it's been suggested that the atomic matter of the material has kind of incorporated this material into the rose granite.
It is an extraordinary lump of stone. I mean, I doubt we'd be able to do that today without proper mechanical cutting tools, diamond-tipped saws, and it's perfect inside. I actually held my my level on my mobile phone against the wall of the box, and it's perfectly 90 degrees. It's extraordinary to think that we're meant to believe that a civilization that only had stone tools, flints, or perhaps copper tools or bronze tools was able to create such a perfect object.
Exactly. I mean, in fact, if we look at the scale, the relevant scale of hardness, steel would not be able to cut this kind of material. So how can copper do that? It just can't. And I think we have to show a level of humility across the board and be open to these more so-called exotic ideas, particularly when we are fully aware and the US government is trying to communicate from some quarters in the intelligence community about these UAPs that are demonstrating capacities beyond known physics to us, certainly within the public sphere.
Well, that's a good segue for us. Let's talk aliens, JP. I mean, do you think it's possible that what we're talking about here is a non-human civilization that shared this planet with humans thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years ago?
Of course, everything is possible. And I think that when we look at some of the depictions in the art, you know, what's to say that they weren't like us, that they weren't human or human-like? Take Amenhotep IV, for example, also known as Akhenaten. An enigmatic pharaoh.
He's a weird-looking dude, let's be honest about it.
He is. I mean, that in itself is ascribed to an anomaly in the art form at the time. They call this the Armanic artwork form. But why would it be that it was introduced, or a different kind of art form, solely introduced at the time of Akhenaten, and then either side are supposedly just standard depictions of pharaonic rulers of the kingdom? Also, Akhenaten, he literally overhauled the religious system. He got rid of all the system of netters, or the so-called gods, and what he did is he introduced this idea of one solar ruler, the Aten.
The sun god.
The sun god, the Aten disk. And he was a massive threat to the Amun-Ra priesthood, who in the end saw him off, leaving his poor young son, Tutankhamun, to rule and restore order.
Ah, so Tutankhamun, as we more popularly say it, was the son of Akhenaten.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow, that's interesting. So let's talk about some of the other things you see that are perhaps suggestive of aliens. I mean, there is, in one temple we went through, you look up and you see, and I'm sorry, you just got to say it. I feel controversial saying it. You see a Black Hawk helicopter. You see what looks like a submarine, and you see a kind of a disc-shaped object. What is it if it's not what it looks like?
It's a good question. The official, or let's say rational explanation, is that the cartouches of the father Seti I and the son Ramses II or Ramses the Great are overlaying one another in what's called a palimpsest. But how
just explain that to me. It goes over my head.
Yeah, a palimpsest is simply a form of writing or artwork that has been changed or overlaid, and it creates, a new image. And that's what the
Okay, I accept that, but they didn't have Black Hawk helicopters, submarines, or flying discs thousands of years ago. I can buy the palimpsest argument that maybe they've put a new lump of plaster on the wall and repainted it. It still shows a Black Hawk helicopter.
It does, and a submarine, and a disc with a tail fin, and all manner of other things.
So what is it, if it's not a Black Hawk helicopter, or a submarine, or a disc?
My suspicion is that there was some form of clairvoyance or insight into what the future would have looked like. I mean, we know about CIA-released documents that talk about controlled remote viewing, which have their protocols in terms of the use of human consciousness to capture information that we couldn't possibly have through satellites and other means of spying, to be frank. Does that mean that you can actually cultivate human consciousness to go back in time and forward in time? I think the answer is yes, according to the esoteric sciences, but it's a form of cultivation that's required. It doesn't mean that this depiction or these cartouches or palimpsests from the Abydos temple in on the Nile is saying that there were those machines present at the time, but we can't avoid the fact that they really do show objects or machines that we have today that somehow they knew about. And I think human consciousness is a good bridge to trying to explain that.
Which is why you think there's a link between the UAP mystery and what you see on the walls of ancient Egypt.
Yes, I do. And again, the first ever experience or UFO sighting I had was an immediate insight into the connection between the mental process, the mental activity of a person, and the appearance of objects or phenomena that appear and that take a physicality and then take a non-physical type exit from this reality.
Let's talk about another mystery in plain sight here in Egypt. You go to the museum, the beautiful new museum that they've built here in Cairo, and you see these magnificent carved stone vases that have lug handles on them quite often. So they couldn't have been turned on a lathe. And we know that ancient Egypt didn't have wheels at that time when they were making these vases. Some of them have been dated, Ben van Kirkwyk told me the other week, to as old as 14,000 years ago, because they were buried with somebody who died 14,000 years ago. That's before known human civilization. So what's the mystery that you see behind those stone vases? Compare them to the pottery vases that you see in the same display cabinets and explain the difference, please.
Yes, it's the vases may be the greatest signature yet of advanced technology. Yet they're probably more easily overlooked because they are not as perhaps inspiring on a bigger scale compared to the temples and the achievements that we see there. But what's amazing is we see on one hand super hard material like diorite, which is a black and white appearing stone. It's beautiful. How do you cut that, let alone almost mold this material to create tubular holes that are curved and maintain a perfect diameter throughout the pottery?
And what's more, as Ben explained to us, they follow a precise mathematical ratio, that they are divine objects in the sense that they're often conforming to sequences in mathematics, mathematical ratios that only became known thousands of years later.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I think we're talking about the Fibonacci sequence or the Da Vinci golden ratio, which is a specific proportion that's found within nature. So there, again, there's this understanding of divine geometry in nature. And on the other hand, Ross, we talked about the hardest material. Let's look at the really brittle stuff like alabaster or flint. We saw an object, a tiny little object that looked like, I forget, maybe a horse, but it was so delicately done. How would you not break something as brittle as flint? It's almost like it's showing off. And I think that what we're going to see when we do our next trip or tour to Peru, when we see these 12 angled type megalithic blocks or tiny little blocks that kind of intersect the other blocks, and there is literally no space for even a sheet of paper to put between them, it seems that there was a way to manipulate physical matter, I should say, and manipulating this material like putty.
Why does it matter, JP? Why do we need to solve the mystery of what happened in ancient Egypt? Why should people even be thinking about it?
I think that what it does is it operates at two levels. There is an ecological and a social benefit, let's say, to reinventing these techniques or rediscovering them in order to live more in harmony with nature, to be more efficient as societies in terms of the way we plan and build our buildings and use our resources. But also, I think, on a deeper level, and this is what I see from ancient Egypt, I see a complete integration of spirituality and geometry into the material or mundane aspects of life. I almost get the impression that there was a total appreciation of unity. So you had artwork and aestheticism, geometry, agriculture, astronomy, all these elements are kind of integrated into their buildings, and there isn't this kind of separation of ideas so much that we are so obsessed with in the Western world today.
What are some of the other things we saw on our trip that twigged your awareness that there really is an astonishing mystery behind the ruins of ancient Egypt and the art of ancient Egypt? We've talked about the unfinished obelisk, we've talked about the box, we've talked about the extraordinary hieroglyphics of the helicopter on the wall. There is another one you told me about where there seems to be, dare I say, a squat little fellow being scrubbed out of existence on a wall. Tell me that story.
Yeah, that's an interesting story, Ross. I mean, when I came to Egypt, I think it was 2.5 years ago, we were walking around the temple of Edfu, which is the temple of Horus, the falcon-headed therianthropic being, the son of Osiris and Isis. And I had some free time to myself, and for some reason I felt sort of guided, I suppose, to a particular area at the back of the temple. And what you can see is that there are areas of the wall that have kind of been scraped out or removed, or concrete has been smothered over. And near there, I just happened to rest my eyes on what appears to be a being, an entity with a large head and a small body and a small base or pair of legs. And
dare I suggest, I'll say it. It looks like a squat little grey alien, doesn't it?
It does. It looks like the outline of a grey. Let's just say it straight up, Ross. Also, it just so happens that next to it, you see a long, elongated cigar-like object and a lenticular disc. I mean, it's odd. I've now asked 2 Egyptologists, and their feedback was, quote, "it's weird," unquote, because they don't actually know what it is.
But isn't it interesting, because it's in a corner of the temple that they never take the public to. There's a bit of scaffolding right plonk in the middle of it. It's not something that they draw the public's attention to.
Now, this is another site. You're right. There is the temple of Luxor, and right at the back, next to a piece of scaffolding where there's been ongoing renovation for I don't know how many years now. And what you see is a netter, or one of the gods called Amen-Min, and he's basically a god of fertility with a very large phallus that he wields about. And what you can see overlaying that is what appears to be a microscopic sperm. And obviously it begs the question, how would they use microscopy or even understand it at a time in the dynastic period.
So you think that what you see there depicted is a sperm?
That's what it looks like, and that's what the context really is strongly suggesting. It may not be, but you've seen it, I've seen it, we've all seen it, and it really is hidden at the back of the temple, and the context is so strong that I find it hard not to accept that.
I think the phenomenon's called pareidolia, where we give meaning to images that perhaps is not the correct meaning. Is it possible that it's pareidolia, that what the hieroglyphicist was doing was trying to depict something else?
It's always possible, but you have a phallus, you have the ejaculation, and you have what appears to be a head with a tail over that precise point. And I just think the context is too strong. But it's always possible.
Sure. Do you think that there are some in conventional Egyptology and archaeology who want to suppress the story?
It's a difficult one to answer. When you talk to people, the common idea or feeling is that there absolutely is a cover-up. I don't want to disparage the Egyptian authorities, but it seems clear that, unusual excavation activities have taken place. There is a lot of secrecy about certain locations, and you do see a lot of hieroglyphs that have been removed in certain temples, and I'm thinking of Karnak and a small section in Edfu Temple as well, and others. And, when you talk to people, they say there is a cover-up. And interestingly, it's not necessarily the Egyptian authorities or any government authority. They don't know who it is, but they think that there is. And if I had to make a bet on a balance, I would probably say there is, to a degree.
Clearly, JP, there is a mystery in plain sight in ancient Egypt, and we don't yet have the answers. It's just like the UAP subject, bewilderingly baffling.
Completely agree with you, and maybe advancing understanding and progress in the UAP disclosure, I hesitate to say movement in the US, it could eventually unlock understanding as to what was going on in ancient or pre-dynastic Egypt and, from that time onwards, because they are, I think, inextricably linked in terms of technologies that are being used. And, we were talking about levitation earlier. I'll give you a little anecdote. I happened to meet somebody I went to school with at a funeral back in 2008. And this individual was studied in the sciences in physics. He went to work with an aerospace contractor. And he said to me, JP, the things that we can do with magnets and electromagnets defy the understanding of our current understanding of physics, and it appears like magic. And he's talking about levitation. So why can't we connect the two dots and entertain the fact that this may have been happening in pre-diluvian ancient Egypt?
I guess the skeptic in me would say that if that technology existed, why isn't it rendered on the walls and in their papyrus writings?
But it is. The levitational aspects are all across ancient Egypt, Ross. Look at Dendara Temple, look at Edfu Temple and others. You see this idea of large beings with rods or other equipment or staffs. They're raising their hands. You see what appear to be dotted lines that represent energy. You see serpents which represent energy. You see waves that represent energy. And you see a logical sequence of events of a temple being on the ground and the temple being raised after the rods are being raised.
So you have a feeling, don't you, an intuition, that there are things the ancient Egyptians knew that we don't know today that could be part of unlocking our understanding of the very notion of human consciousness. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that the Eye of Horus in the Egyptian hieroglyphics looks just like the pineal gland in the human brain.
That's right. It really is in plain sight, as you would say. And I think they knew things. And what I extract from all of this is that the ancient Egyptians were allegoric. They were communicating through symbols these ideas that they knew about that appeal to our subconscious minds, which may understand far more than our conscious minds. And the issue is that we're not connecting the two. You look at the hieroglyphs, they are speaking to something. It's not just gobbledygook, like, the current icons that we use or, in messaging today, for example. They were almost archetypal images. They're speaking to aspects of the human self, which is operating at multiple layers of reality, in my view, and according to the esoteric sciences. And it's sort of a process of rediscovery and unlocking what is already known to us, but in compartmentalized aspects of the self.
JP, thank you so much for joining us on Reality Check. I look forward to having another excellent adventure with you sometime soon.
Thank you, Ross. Let's do this really soon.
Thanks for watching. Go to joinnn.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And please don't forget to click that red subscribe button to ensure you get more of NewsNation's unbiased and fact-driven news coverage.